Hello, friends. I think drunkenly one night someone suggested that I record little mini PowerPoint lectures on Moby-Dick, as it is my favorite novel, and I will never get people to actually read it. But maybe if I do this, I can at least get it out of my system, and if there is an audience for it, that's great. Um, but either way, here's a chance for me to just kind of, refresh it, review it in a way that's fun. But let's go ahead and just start with the book itself. We'll start with the title of the book. We'll go into the opening sections because at its heart, it's really kind of a very strange book in the way that it's laid out. There's a lot of things in the very beginning before we even get to the chapter one, the novel of it. Um, but it's still part of the novel, right? It's still something new and different and engaging, and it's very much worth talking about, not just jumping ahead into what is the hooking story, right? The story that everyone knows. Captain Ahab seeks revenge on this monstrous whale that eventually kills him. Right? That's the story. That's like the plot line. But that's not what the book is, right? That took me a sentence to say, and you kind of know it's coming a mile away. Even us, the contemporary reader who has dealt with Moby Dick in popular culture, we as reading it is something different. It's something akin to traveling. We know the importance of London, but that's different than being in London. We know the importance of Athens, but that's different than being in Athens. And so in that regard, we know what Moby Dick is about, but that's different than reading Moby Dick, which is its own experience, and what it brings to the table is, in my opinion, unparalleled. Just an absolutely phenomenal book. It's a very strange book, um, but let's go into what all of that means. So the full title of the book is Moby Dick with a dash in it. Typically, the dash refers to the novel, whereas Moby Dick without the dash refers to the actual whale. Moby Dick or The Whale, published in 1851. It was originally published in 3 volumes in England as just The Whale. Um, Interesting for the Great American Novel to first be published in England, but that's neither here nor there. The same year it was published in the United States in 1 volume called Moby Dick or The Whale, with a epilogue added as well. The original 3 volume version in England did not have the epilogue, which caused some issues with readers in England not quite getting what the book was about. So the epilogue was forced in, and the epilogue itself is just this one-page little bit that's gorgeously beautiful when we get there. Um, but we will get there, and we will talk about the epilogue when we get to the epilogue. If we get to the epilogue, if we do this entire series, let's see what happens. We got Herman Melville, born 1819, died 1891. Really a an interesting story. It was like he was born into wealth. His family were very wealthy merchants on both sides of his family. He could date back his grandparents to fighting in the Revolutionary War. Um, Very established. But when he was a young teen, I want to say, maybe even before that, maybe even a preteen, um, Herman Melville's father passed away. His father dies, um, leaving his family kind of destitute. So Herman Melville was going to school, and when his father died, the ability to pay for schooling what got thrown into question. He spent some time working as a clerk for a bank, or he also filled in as a teacher while he was trying to pay for his own schooling as a teenager. Like he was like 18 years old, 17, 18 years old, working as a primary school teacher while trying to pay for his own education. And so that whole time was pretty tumultuous for Herman Melville. And it's no real surprise that when he was 20 years old, he hopped on a sailing ship. He hopped on a merchant vessel, not as a passenger, but as a worker, as someone to do the work. He eventually abandoned ship with some other friends. He was working on a ship that was um, very tough to work on. A very cruel captain uh, which may influence some of his future books. But anyway, he abandoned ship on an island in the South Pacific. And from that experience, he goes on to get a lot of success as an author, writing three books, Taipei, Omu, and Mardi, which are essentially travel logs. It's him more or less talking about the cultures of the people he interacted with. And for, given this time period, the late 1840s, this is what Herman Melville was known for as an author. And until his death, like, his contemporaries mostly knew him as an author of travel logs, of these books. Taipei in particular was a bestseller of talking about his experiences with native people in the South Pacific. And so that connection to native people comes back over and over and over again, even throughout Moby Dick, but definitely throughout all the writing of Melville. He's very mindful of the indigenous folk. Whether the ship itself in Moby Dick is called the Pequod, after a tribe of indigenous Americans, and he named his estate Arrowhead after all of the arrowheads from natives that he found on the property. So he, as an American in the 1850s, very much grounded in the respect for the land and the native peoples who were displaced, and native peoples across the world that were touched by European exploration. Exploration in quotes, as how can you explore something that is already seen? But either way, like, that sort of sensitivity, I think carries throughout the work and is worth touching upon, especially for something known as the Great American Novel. We sometimes conflate some of our interpretations of what that expansionary period of America was like, but it's not like, sometimes the excuses thrown around is they didn't know better, but I think it's very clear that a lot of people did know better, and Melville certainly was one who knew better and explained as much. After the travelogues, he wrote a couple of romance adventures about sailors, Redburn and Whitejacket, which are more romanticized, sort of fantastical, not fantastical, but more, less grounded in the reality of his travels and more trying to make an interesting plot structure. I haven't read Redburn, but I have read Whitejacket. Whitejacket itself is a pretty interesting story of just a sailor who just doesn't fit in with the rest of the crew. He keeps copies of books inside of his coat, his white jacket. He keeps copies of books inside of his cloak as kind of like his protection. So he's kind of like this educated man amongst sailors, which kind of fits with Melville's personal story a little bit. And the name itself, White Jacket, was the fact that the main character wore a white jacket while everyone else wore black jackets, and how that made him stand out and how that drew attention to him and kind of what that meant. And so this whiteness versus blackness, or this whiteness versus darkness, is a recurring theme in a lot of Melville's work. Whether or not we want to associate that with necessarily the way that we currently interpret whiteness as a cultural identity, it's kind of tough to tell about how aware of that Melville was, if that's what he was specifically talking about. But I think there's a lot of strong evidence when we talk again about the way he talks about native peoples, non-European peoples, and the way that they interact with Europeans. I think it's very clear that some of the negativity that he expresses towards whiteness, we could definitely extrapolate that to to have a double meaning, a metaphorical meaning, a tongue-in-cheek meaning about European Americans as well. In the 1850s, he started writing books like Moby-Dick and Pierre. His short stories like Bartleby the Scrivener. That's kind of like his main literary period, and honestly, it was the least successful period of his writing career. Moby-Dick, as much as we celebrate it now, is a modern invention of caring about this novel. Moby-Dick really came into vogue in the 100 years after his birth, is kind of like this revelation of Moby-Dick as a piece of literature. We have the likes of people in literary circles like William Faulkner to celebrate this book, who read it and kind of extolled the virtues to the masses. So pretty much Moby-Dick, Pierre, these were failures. Moby-Dick, it walks this weird line of being in a romance adventure. That's what people see in it. Part romance adventure, part travelogue, and part just like esoteric um, meditations on work. It's a very strange book at its core, so it's not terribly surprising it wasn't very successful. In his later life, he mostly wrote poetry while working for I think he worked for the post office, became a clerk for the post office in his later years while working on a book of poetry, or many books of poetry. The most famous of which is Battle Pieces, which is meditations on the Civil War, written like during and immediately after the Civil War. So it's a very interesting look at what life was like then, and great piece of poetry. I enjoyed it. Yada yada yakety schmackety. Let's talk about Moby Dick a little more, and actually the real life Moby Dick, which was there was an actual whale called Mocha-Dick. Um, Mocha-Dick was like in the early parts of the 1800s, was kind of like a whaling legend. And so, you know, if you knew whalers, they would talk about this whale, this white whale with barnacles all across its forehead, that was just stoving ships and just being an utter menace. And in fact, like later on, this book, Mocha-Dick, or The White Whale of the Pacific, obviously ripping its name from Moby-Dick, it's kind of this weird self-referential thing where Moby-Dick itself is referencing Mocha-Dick. Anyway, this came out a few years after Moby-Dick. I just thought it was an interesting sort of nod to the cycle of life. It was named Mocha-Dick after being seen around Mocha Islands off of Chile. And here's some, you know, some ocean scenes and some maps and all this sort of nonsense. All that's important. But let's go ahead and actually crack the cover, look into it, and start with the dedication, because the dedication itself is kind of interesting. It says, in token of my admiration for his genius, this book is inscribed to Nathaniel Hawthorne. They were, I mean, it's tough to really describe what the relationship between Melville and Hawthorne was. It was part fandom on Melville's part. He was 15 years the junior to Nathaniel Hawthorne, but admired him greatly, wrote him letters, of which one critic described as full of sexual energy. Um, yeah, so I mean, it's hard to really tell. I mean, there's a lot of theories that they were gay for each other, or maybe Melville just had the hots for Hawthorne, or maybe who the hell knows what any of it was. From what we can tell, the relationship consisted of 10 letters, maybe 3 to 5 visits. Not a lot of interaction, all told, but definitely an admiration for a like-minded person. Though I kind of find, Hawthorne's work I find a little bit more grounded in reality, in a way that Melville is a little bit more philosophical, but Melville also grounds everything into the physical nature of the world. It's a very tactile, it's a very sensory sort of world that he describes, while then jumping to these wild philosophical tangents and interludes and all of that. Anyway, that's how the book begins. You then turn the pages and you get this massive table of contents, right? It's this absolutely huge table of contents. 130 some odd chapters. Most chapters are around, like, I don't know, 4 pages long. Some are shorter. Some chapters are a single paragraph. But some of the chapters are very long. Um, we can kind of like view the structure. It's kind of tough to view the structure because it does jump a lot. But you can view like the first like 22 chapters is just the Nantucket chapters. This is before the journey on the Pequod starts. This is based in Nantucket Island. So we kind of start there. And then the rest of the book is a mix of cetology, the work of whaling, and this narrative of Ahab and Moby Dick and the rest of the crew. And they're kind of jumbled together and kind of go in arcs and flows. Like, cetology is just, there's a lot of information about whales, most of which is completely inaccurate, and also known to be inaccurate. Like, it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek sort of like, how do we know things? It's like this epistemological sort of question of how do we know anything? And Melville, through Ishmael, just kind of tells us shit that was not true, but it's what people were saying. And so, it's kind of an interesting sort of aside, of of and it's just an interesting look at what we know about whales, and kind of this playful way of thinking about what do we know about anything. Then there's the actual work of whaling, which is really celebrated as like, how do men work together, and what does that mean, and what are the jobs, and how is it done, and like, we'll have these philosophical treatises on what it means to like slice open the side of a whale's skull, and the order in which the whole thing is done, and what does it mean to look down and see the shark circling. Like, there's a lot there of just what are those meditations of work. It's like, have you ever had that daydream when you're at work and you're like, what does this moment mean about society? That's kind of what the whole book is what does any of this mean about who we are as people. And then, of course, there's the Ahab and Moby-Dick narrative, which is probably the most famous part of the book. Is the obsession with the white whale, and how does a monomaniac like Ahab, what does that mean for society, where we can have one person who has completely lost their shit, and if no one is there to check him, what does that mean for all of society? And I think that resonates pretty well in modern times about what happens when you have a shit leader. Even if you understand him, even if you understand where he's coming from, even if you understand his motivations, what the fuck does that mean for us? So it's an interesting layout. 135 chapters, a lot of great titles. We'll get through it. Blah blah blah. Let's move on. Next is the etymology, which I fucking love. The etymology and the extracts are these two like early sections of the book that are short and very weird, and very much making a commentary about the way we process information. Like, etymology, it says, supplied by a late consumptive usher to a grammar school. So then it's just like dictionary definitions of what a whale is, and it's kind of making fun of that whole idea of like, well, Webster's literally here, right? Webster dictionary is here. It's like, oh well, Webster says a whale is this, and it's kind of like cruel. Like, it kind of starts like, before this happens, it says, the pale usher, threadbare in coat, heart, body, and brain, I see him now. So it's kind of like the fucking stupid teacher, who has no fucking ideas what's going on, fucking threadbare in coat, has no money, threadbare in heart, has no love, threadbare in body is a wimp, and in brain is stupid. So it's kind of like describing the way people describe things. It's like we listen to people who are like, well, the definition is this, that, or the other, and Melville is just fucking calling these people out. It's like, these people are stupid. These people are idiots, and like, this is what they give us. Like the name of the novel is The Whale, right? It's 136 chapters. 135 chapters and an epilogue. 135 chapters and an epilogue about the concept of the whale, and what the fuck does the whale mean, and how deep does this go. But some jackass on the internet, or in this case, some jackass fucking grammar school teacher can be like, I can define a whale in one page. Here's the Webster dictionary definition, and here's whale in a bunch of different languages, so we kind of understand what's going on. And it's like, clearly not. Like, clearly this is an insufficient way of trying to understand things. So it kind of starts off with a shot off that bow, which I think is interesting, right? It's like, if you want to know what the whale is, here we go. We got Webster, we're done. If you want to know what a whale is, here's how it's said in Latin, and here's how it's said in Dutch, and here's how which is actually German, but that's Dutch and German as languages and words are its own history. Blah, 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 blah. Here's how people say whale. Who cares, right? That's not enough. So then we go to the next section. We go to the extracts, which is like better, but still making fun of the way people fucking define things and talk about things. Supplied by a sub-librarian. So like, there's the librarian, and then there's the sub-librarian, and then there's the sub-librarian. Like, who the hell is this low librarian on the totem pole? And this is just pages and pages of like footnotes, references, etc. it makes a big point of kind of calling it out, like this is for entertainment only. Um, like don't overthink this. Like it's garbage too. Um, what does he say here? Hold on. Let me actually look it up. Um, it will be seen that this mere painstaking burrower and grubworm of a poor devil of a sub appears to have gone through the long Vaticans in street stalls of the earth, picking up whatever random allusions to whales he could anyways find in any book whatsoever, sacred or profane. So it's like, okay, so instead of just defining it by Webster, here's this next level of idiot who just collects every reference to whale and puts it together. And it's like, oh, that's what whale is. And so it starts with Genesis, right? And God created great whales. This is in Genesis 1:21. And it's just like, who gives a shit? That's not what we're talking about. In the middle, of course, there's this. It's very long. It's like 4 or 5 pages. In the middle, it's like there's this reference to that Hawthorne made, which I think is funny, as he's dedicated in the book. We also get one of Hawthorne's references of whale. I built a cottage for Susan and myself, made in the gateway in the form of Gothic arch by setting up a whale jaw's bone. Nothing to do with anything. There it is. But of course, it ends with a working song, which I think is really important because it kind of seems like the working song is closer to the truth than Genesis, right? Oh, the rare old whale mid-storm and gale in his home will be a giant and might where might is right and king of the boundless sea. I don't know, I just made that shit up. But, like, it kind of starts with this biblical reference and calls it bullshit. And then just goes through all the literary references. Like, there's a ton, like, I'm just kind of scanning this. Like, Pliny is referenced, Fuller, Shakespeare's reference, doctors are referenced, Sir Thomas Browne, Spencer. It's insane. Like Hobbes, philosophy. John Bunyan from Pilgrim's Promise, Milton's Paradise Lost. It's exhaustive. Like it's a very Sir Thomas Herbert. Like all of these like long little excerpts about whales. It's just kind of like, here's what important people said about whales. So this, Alexander Pope in Rape of the Lock, like Captain Cook, James Cook, and what what he said about whales, and like none of Thomas Jefferson. None of it has anything to do with anything. It's just like, this is what people have said about whales. Therefore, does that give us a better idea of what a whale is? And it doesn't. And I think what this does is it really sets up that idea of common knowledge and kind of rejects it. This kind of idea that like, oh, if we just look at definitions and what people have said about it, we'll understand it. And it's just kind of like, maybe we shouldn't. Maybe that's not what we're talking about. So when we're talking about the whale, this isn't what we're talking about. We aren't talking about definitions. We aren't talking about famous sayings about whales. We're going into a deeper meditation of what the whale is. So that's kind of how we start the book, is here are some ineffective, untrustworthy, non-useful definitions of whales. And what the fuck does that even mean for us? And how do we move forward? And what is the whale? So we're gonna start there. That's gonna be how we begin. Is unhappy with what we know, and I'm not saying we're gonna be happy with what we know by the time we finish it, but we're going to definitely explore whaling in a lot more detail. So hell yeah, that's it. That's the beginning. That's the first video of this. We'll do chapter 1 next time. Loomings, which is a hell of a chapter, hell of a way to start a book, and we'll go from there. So thank you very much.